On January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood in front of a packed room of reporters at his headquarters in Belgium. He had summoned them himself. The war in Europe was entering its final act. The snow outside lay heavy and dirty from weeks of fighting, and everyone expected a routine briefing. A few maps, some talk of enemy casualties, maybe a reassuring line about Allied progress. Instead, Montgomery was about to light a political fuse under the Allied command. He wore his trademark beret with its two badges, his uniform neat, his posture relaxed and controlled. To the British and American correspondents crowding into the room, he looked confident, almost casual, like a man very sure of the story he was about to tell. They took out notebooks, prepared for the standard narrative about how the Battle of the Bulge had been fought and won. What they actually heard would, within hours, shake the highest levels of Allied leadership. Within 24 hours, General Omar Bradley would be writing out his resignation. Within 48, Winston Churchill would be fighting to hold the Anglo-American alliance together. Within a week, Eisenhower's entire command structure in Europe would be teetering on the edge of a political crisis. To understand how a single press conference could do that much damage, you have to go back to how the Battle of the Bulge began. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched his last great gamble in the West. Before dawn, 29 German divisions slammed into thin American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. It was the kind of attack the Allies thought the Germans no longer had the strength to make. They were wrong. The offensive achieved total surprise. In the first days, German armor and infantry punched through weak American positions, shattering inexperienced units and tearing a deep wedge, 60 miles long, into the Allied front. That wedge, the Bulge, threatened to drive all the way to the critical port of Antwerp, the lifeline of Allied logistics. Entire American divisions were overrun, surrounded, or scattered in the first 48 hours. Radios failed, headquarters lost contact with regiments, and the front dissolved into pockets of desperate resistance in freezing forests and ruined villages. For the United States Army, it would become the largest and bloodiest battle of the war in Europe, with tens of thousands of casualties in 6 brutal weeks. The first few days were chaos, exhausted infantry fighting in snow and fog, artillery firing blind, commanders trying to figure out where their own troops even were, let alone the enemy's. By December 20th, 4 days into the offensive, the German Bulge had split the American front in two. In the south, Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg struggled to maintain reliable contact with the American armies north of the penetration. Wires were cut, roads were clogged or lost, and messages were delayed or garbled. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a nightmare. A fast-moving enemy, a broken front, and fragile communications between his commanders. He made a decision that was tactically reasonable and politically explosive. Eisenhower temporarily placed all Allied forces north of the German penetration under the command of Bernard Montgomery. That meant the United States First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the United States Ninth Army under General William Simpson, 2 American armies that had been under Omar Bradley's control since Normandy, were now to answer to a British field marshal. When Eisenhower told Bradley, the reaction was immediate and angry. Bradley had led those armies through months of hard fighting. Now, in the middle of a crisis, they were being handed to a British commander he neither trusted nor liked. He argued fiercely against the change. The communication problems, he insisted, were temporary and manageable. Giving Montgomery control of American forces would look like a vote of no confidence in American leadership, a public humiliation that Congress and the American public would not forget. Bradley warned Eisenhower that it would be politically explosive. American soldiers were doing most of the fighting and dying in Europe. And now, just as things went wrong, the story would be that a British general had to come in and straighten everything out. Eisenhower listened, but he had already decided. Operationally, Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern sector. He had a clearer picture of that part of the front and could coordinate the defense more effectively. On paper, at least. The decision stood. Montgomery arrived at Hodges' 1st Army headquarters on December 20th, like a man stepping onto a damaged ship he had been asked to steady. Later, he would describe the situation he found as one of near total disorganization. He claimed American commanders did not know where many of their units were. His chief of staff wrote that they found Hodges exhausted, hollow-eyed, and unsure. Montgomery immediately set about tidying up the battle, as he liked to put it. He pulled back exposed units to more defensible lines, consolidated scattered formations, and positioned reserves for counterattacks. He brought in the British 30th Corps as a strategic reserve behind the American front, ready to plug gaps or exploit opportunities. To be fair, Montgomery performed competently. He imposed order on a chaotic front in the north and built a solid defensive shoulder to block further German advances in that sector. But while he was organizing the northern half of the Bulge, the most dramatic move of the battle was happening in the south, under a man who hated being on the defensive, George S. Patton. On December 19th, 3 days after the German attack began, Patton did something that still amazes military historians. He took 3 divisions from his 3rd Army, disengaged them from their current offensive, turned them 90 degrees to the north, and started them marching through winter roads toward the town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. It was a logistical and operational feat that many thought impossible. Yet on December 26th, Patton's spearheads broke through the ring around Bastogne, opening a corridor to the paratroopers who had held out in the snow and rubble with dwindling ammunition and supplies. The Screaming Eagles were not relieved by British troops from the north. They were saved by American armor attacking from the south. By early January, Patton's forces were driving into the Bulge from below, while Hodges' 1st Army pressed in from above. The German offensive, its momentum gone, was being crushed between 2 converging American jaws. By the first days of January, the outcome was obvious. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed. And that is when Bernard Montgomery decided to talk. He told his staff he wanted a press conference to clarify what had happened and to make sure the British people understood the role their soldiers and their commander had played. His staff, who understood American sensitivities better than he did, advised him not to. The Americans were touchy about the whole arrangement, they warned. Better to let Eisenhower make any big public statements about the battle. Montgomery brushed the advice aside. He believed, sincerely, that he could explain things in a way that would be seen as fair and honest. So, on that cold day in January, he stepped up in front of the microphones with prepared notes in hand, determined to set the record straight. At first, the briefing sounded like any other. Montgomery described the initial German onslaught, the depth of the penetration, the threat to Antwerp, and how he had taken over the northern sector. The reporters listened. Then he began to shift the narrative. "The battle has been most interesting," he said in his clipped, precise style. "I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled." The American correspondents in the room went very still. "I have ever handled," not "we handled," not "the Americans handled." He was describing the Battle of the Bulge as his battle, something he had personally managed. He went on. The first thing he did, he explained, was to make the battle area tidy, to sort it out. He talked about pulling the Americans back into more coherent defensive lines, about organizing their formations properly, about preparing his own reserves for the moment when they would be unleashed. It was all told in the first person, his decisions, his organization, his handling. Then he turned to the British role. He described how he had taken certain steps to ensure that if the Germans reached the Meuse River, they would not cross it. He spoke of deploying the full power of the British group of armies, bringing that power into action carefully at first so as not to interfere with American lines of communication, and then, finally, committing British divisions with a bang. He painted a picture of British troops fighting on both flanks of American forces that had suffered a hard blow. In his mind, it was a flattering picture of Allied cooperation, British units bracketing American ones, helping them hold firm after a terrible shock. To the American reporters, it sounded very different. What they heard was this: the Americans had been badly beaten, their lines had broken, they had gotten into trouble, and then a British commander had arrived, cleaned up the mess, and used British forces to save the situation. The implication was unmistakable. Without Montgomery, the Americans might have lost the battle. Montgomery then described the result as a great Allied victory, and added that the current operations to seal off the salient were being very well handled by General Bradley, as if Bradley's performance had improved only after Montgomery had reorganized everything. When a reporter asked about Patton's role in relieving Bastogne, Montgomery offered a brief, almost perfunctory acknowledgement that Patton had done very well indeed, and then pivoted straight back to discussing his own dispositions. The British press loved it. London newspapers ran jubilant headlines implying that Montgomery had rescued his American allies from disaster. Stories spoke of Monty stepping in to set things right when inexperienced American commanders had been overwhelmed. After years of rationing, bombing, and sacrifice, the British public was in no mood to see itself as a junior partner to anyone. They embraced the idea that once again, their general had shown the world how war should be fought. Across the Atlantic and in American field camps across Europe, the reaction was thunderous, and not in Montgomery's favor. American correspondents who had been in that room sent back stories that emphasized his relentless use of "I handled" and his implication that American commanders had lost control. Stateside newspapers ran editorials filled with anger and disbelief. After weeks in which American units had absorbed the main shock of the German attack, the idea that a British general was now taking credit felt like a slap in the face. In Europe, where tens of thousands of exhausted soldiers read stars and stripes in muddy tents and makeshift dugouts, the response was even harsher. These were the men who had held crossroads at places like Bastogne and Saint-Vith, who had watched friends freeze and bleed in the Ardennes snow. They did not appreciate the suggestion that they had to be saved. Omar Bradley, at his headquarters in Luxembourg, read the press reports and reached his breaking point. For more than 2 years, he had endured Montgomery's arrogance and condescension, the lectures, the second-guessing, the way Montgomery seemed to assume British methods were superior. He had swallowed his pride when Eisenhower gave Montgomery temporary command of his American armies. He had accepted the implied criticism that came with that decision for the sake of Allied unity. This, he decided, was too much. Bradley sat down and wrote out his resignation as commander of the 12th Army Group. He showed it to his senior officers. His chief of staff supported him. Other generals hinted that if he stepped down in protest, they might follow. If Bradley resigned over Montgomery's press conference, it would not be a quiet matter. It would explode in Washington. Congress would demand to know why a leading American commander had felt compelled to quit in the middle of the war because of a British field marshal's behavior. When Eisenhower heard what Bradley was about to do, he understood instantly that this was the most dangerous political crisis of his tenure as Supreme Commander. If Bradley resigned, the entire fabric of the Anglo-American alliance could begin to tear. Eisenhower called Bradley and urged him to hold off. "Give me 48 hours," he said. "Let me deal with Montgomery. Let me try to repair this before you act." Reluctantly, Bradley agreed to wait. Then, Eisenhower picked up the phone to Montgomery. The conversation was tense. Eisenhower told him bluntly that his press conference had caused an uproar. American generals were furious. Bradley was on the verge of resigning. The newspapers were full of stories portraying Montgomery as a glory hunter, taking credit for an American victory. The situation, Eisenhower said, was intolerable. Montgomery seemed genuinely surprised. He insisted that he had praised the Americans, called the outcome a great Allied victory, and used the phrase, "a fine Allied picture." In his mind, the problem was not what he had said, but how it was being interpreted. He did not grasp how his tone, his constant focus on his own role, and his casual dismissal of Patton had landed. Eisenhower tried to explain. It was not any single phrase, he argued, but the overall impression that Montgomery had handled the battle while the Americans blundered, that British troops had been the decisive element, that American commanders were afterthoughts who had only begun to handle things well once Montgomery had sorted them out. Reluctantly, Montgomery agreed to issue a clarification, though he clearly felt it was more a matter of politics than necessity. Winston Churchill did not need any convincing. He saw the danger at once. For years he had worked to keep the alliance with the United States strong, knowing Britain's survival depended on it. Now, a single careless press conference by his most famous general threatened to undo that work. On January 18, 1945, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to deliver a carefully crafted speech about the Battle of the Bulge. He knew every sentence would be read in Washington and in American headquarters across Europe. He began by praising the courage and skill of United States forces in the Ardennes. He emphasized, bluntly and repeatedly, that the battle had been overwhelmingly an American fight. He pointed out that American troops had borne the vast majority of the casualties, that it was American divisions that had faced the full weight of the German assault, and that American commanders had played the central roles in the victory. Churchill did not ignore British efforts. He mentioned Montgomery's contribution in stabilizing the northern shoulder and the role of British units in the later stages. But he made it unmistakably clear that the Americans had done almost all the fighting and suffered almost all the losses. He reminded Parliament that behind the statistics lay personal tragedies. Telegrams of death and injury going to American homes day after day. It was a diplomatic masterstroke. Without directly attacking Montgomery, Churchill publicly corrected the impression that Britain had saved the Americans. He reassured the United States that his government recognized and honored their sacrifices. 3 days later, on January 21, 1945, Montgomery released his own clarification. It was, in keeping with his character, more explanation than apology. He stated that he had always held American soldiers and their commanders in the highest regard. He insisted that his intention had been to illustrate Allied cooperation, not to belittle anyone. But even in this, he could not help reminding readers that he was absolutely devoted to Eisenhower and regarded him as one of the great Allied leaders of the war, a phrase that, to suspicious American eyes, implied that Montgomery saw himself on the same level, a great leader judging another. American generals read the clarification and remained unconvinced. They had long since formed their own opinions of Montgomery. and the press conference had confirmed the worst of them. After Churchill's speech and Montgomery's statement, Eisenhower went back to Bradley. He had done what he could publicly to repair the damage. Now he needed Bradley to stay. For the sake of the war effort, he said, they could not afford a rupture. Bradley agreed to withdraw his resignation, but only on conditions. First, Eisenhower had to promise that Montgomery would never again command American troops, except in the most extreme emergency. Second, Eisenhower himself would retain direct command of the Allied offensive into Germany. There would be no more temporary arrangements handing extra authority to Montgomery for tidying up a sector. Eisenhower accepted both demands. The consequences of that January press conference rippled through the rest of the war and beyond. American generals who had once merely tolerated Montgomery now actively disliked and distrusted him. Bradley avoided being in the same room with him unless Eisenhower was present to act as a buffer. Patton turned Montgomery's caution and self-regard into punchlines, and jokes about British generals taking the credit circulated through American mess halls. The alliance held, but it was not the same. What had once been a rough but genuine camaraderie between British and American commanders became more guarded. British officers grew more careful in their public comments about American performance. American officers became more sensitive to any hint of patronizing criticism. Eisenhower had to spend more time managing egos and national pride, less time simply focusing on strategy. Montgomery himself never truly grasped why his press conference had caused such an explosion. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote about the Battle of the Bulge as if his role had been central and decisive. He portrayed himself as the man who had imposed order on chaos and prevented disaster. The American reaction, in his view, had been driven by politics and jealousy, not by anything he had done wrong. History has rendered a cooler judgment. Most modern historians acknowledge that Montgomery did solid professional work in the North during the Bulge. He stabilized a dangerous situation, ensured that the Meuse was defended, and coordinated British reinforcements effectively. But they also agree that the decisive elements in the battle were American. The units that absorbed the initial shock, the paratroopers who held Bastogne, and Patton's daring maneuver and attack from the south once the weather cleared and Allied air power could return to the skies. British troops who entered the battle later fought bravely, but they did so after the crisis had passed. The worst had already been endured by American infantry, tank crews, and artillerymen who had refused to break under the German assault. Montgomery's press conference matters because it exposed a fault line that had run beneath the alliance from the beginning. The British had been in the war since 1939, long before the United States entered. Their army, though battered, was professional and experienced. Their generals had honed their skills in North Africa and Italy. Many of them saw the Americans as brave and determined, but green, prone to mistakes that veteran British officers believed they would have avoided. The Americans, on the other hand, were providing the bulk of the manpower, equipment, and industrial power for the final drive into Germany. They saw themselves not as junior partners, but as the main force now carrying the war. They resented any suggestion that they needed British supervision. Montgomery's words on that January day seemed to confirm the worst American fears, that some British leaders still saw them as clumsy amateurs who needed a British hand to keep them from blundering. His inability to see why that would infuriate them only deepened the wound. For Eisenhower, the episode was a brutal reminder of how delicate his job really was. He was not simply a military commander. He was the manager of a coalition, juggling national pride, political constraints, and the oversized personalities of his top generals. When Montgomery's press conference nearly split the alliance, Eisenhower had to spend precious time and energy patching things up instead of focusing solely on beating the Germans. It also shaped the final phase of the campaign in Europe. Montgomery had long argued for a concentrated, single thrust toward Berlin under his command, with other Allied forces supporting. After the press conference, that was politically impossible. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, spreading the advance across a wide line, was not only a military choice, but a political one. He could not be seen as favoring the British general who had just alienated so many American officers. In the end, Montgomery achieved the opposite of what he supposedly intended. He wanted to highlight the contribution of British troops in the Ardennes. Instead, he triggered a wave of resentment that led many Americans to minimize British involvement. He wanted to burnish his own reputation as a master of battle. Instead, he cemented an image of himself, at least in American eyes, as arrogant, tone-deaf, and incapable of sharing credit. He wanted to show that British leadership still mattered at the highest level. Instead, he guaranteed that his own influence over American forces would be sharply limited for the rest of the war. On that winter day in January 1945, Bernard Montgomery spoke to a room full of journalists for less than an hour. In that short span, he nearly blew up the Allied command structure, drove one of America's top generals to the edge of resignation, forced Winston Churchill into emergency damage control, and narrowed his own future role in the campaign against Nazi Germany. The press conference that almost shattered the Allied command stands as a reminder that in war, as in every human endeavor, words can be as dangerous as weapons. How a leader speaks about others, their sacrifices, their achievements, their failures, can unite or divide, heal or wound. Sometimes, the wisest thing a commander can do is share the credit, downplay his own heroics, and let others stand in the spotlight. Montgomery never quite learned that lesson. And on January 7, 1945, his failure to understand how his words would sound to exhausted American soldiers who had just lived through the greatest battle in their army's history brought the alliance that was winning the war to the brink of fracture at the very moment it needed unity most.